Alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Dear viewers, hello and welcome to the Open Dialogue. Today we will be discussing the effect of the Russia and Ukraine war on us here in the United Kingdom. Of course, the Russia-Ukraine war has had global effects, but to discuss the effects particularly on the citizens of the United Kingdom, we have with us our expert guest, who is a political analyst and an author of 6 books, Mr. Rodney Shakespeare. Joining us for the discussion is also Hujjatul Islam wal Muslimin, Syed Mohammad Razavi, who is the head of the Religious Advisory Board at the Shia Islamic Education Society in London. He has experience of over 40 years in dealing with social and domestic issues for clients both in the United Kingdom and worldwide. Hello and welcome to the program, Rodney, and thank you for joining us and accepting our invitation.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum, Syed. Thank you for joining. Now, before we... Thank you. So I think I'll start with you, Rodney. You mentioned when we were speaking earlier, a few days ago, regarding this topic, you mentioned that the world is fast shifting from a unipolar world to a multipolar world. Please, could you explain this further to myself and the viewers? What did you mean by that?
Well, first of all, it's big. Shall we go back to, and it's been going on a long time, 2008. Roughly round about then, you could say that the United States dominated the world. It effectively controlled the financial system, its practices and the movements of money. It gave leadership in a diplomacy. Its military expenditure was half the world expenditure. And it would be fair to say that if they didn't dominate it by open means, they dominated by secret means. The American agents are masters and mistresses of blackmail, spying, bribery, and when these don't work, either you or a member of your family could get killed. And that's the unipolar dominance of the United States. But then it's been going wrong. On the diplomatic front, failure after failure. Well, starting in 2003, Iraq was a failure. Then in 2011, you get that disaster, which was Libya. Then coming more up to date, you get the debacle and complete failure of all policy in every respect, which was called Afghanistan. And you are now in the process of seeing another debacle, and that's in fact Ukraine. And the Ukraine situation has precipitated an awareness of the change. The old financial system dominated by the United States. The United States has abused its position. And now the whole world knows now that the United States can sanction you and try and control you. So on the one hand, the United States is using its power to try and control, for example, Russia. And on the other hand, the whole situation is reversing, as country after country around the world are starting to look in a different way. Now, I'll very quickly just give you just 2 examples of that.
Right.
If you take something called BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, 2 countries have just applied to join them. Those countries are Iran and Argentina. And the purpose of BRICS is actually to create a new global financial mechanism, which is outside the control of the United States.
Yeah.
The other point is that what's happening in South America, which is normally the backyard, where America goes down there, kicks everybody around, and when it gets really upset, it kills them. America has funded and instigated violent coups in America for centuries. But what happened recently? There was a meeting in, I think, Los Angeles, of the countries of North America and South America. 5 countries refused to attend because 3 countries have been excluded. That's 8. And the leader troublemaker in that lot, believe it or not, was Mexico. Now, yes, these countries still have to deal in a normal way with other countries, etc. But if you wanted something to symbolize the times of great shifts in power and people standing up and being counted, of a move towards a new financial system, those points which I've just sort of illustrated to you, and I'll just take one more. On the military level, since 2005, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization has been quietly creating military contacts and economic and political and diplomatic contacts. And Iran has applied and I believe been accepted. Now, all these things are now going on, and there's nothing that America or the West can do. All they can do is to try and imitate it. And they are failing. Whereas these other movements, these other agreements are moving very, very fast. And the war in Ukraine, which we can talk about more in a moment, the war in Ukraine is speeding these things up in a massive way.
Yes. A very interesting analysis there. Syed Mohammad, I would like to come to you now with the next question, and that is, we have of course seen that the president of the Ukraine is trying to put more pressure on the G7 countries in order to increase the imposed sanctions. Those sanctions have had ripple effects, of course, that were placed on Russia. Now, but there are countries which are non-Western that are opposed to more sanctions. Following on from what Rodney was saying, is that there are more world powers emerging that are having a share of that control. What would you like to say that why are certain countries not in favor of more sanctions on Russia? And who do sanctions really affect? When sanctions are placed on opposing parties, on opponents, who do they impact the most?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. First of all, sanctions does not solve any problem. We need to deal with the root cause of the problems in the world, and what is obvious from what is happening in Ukraine is the battle of power, and of course, Russia has its right to protect itself, and America is trying to fear from other part of the world and impose their own point of view on the local area here. And that's the habit of America in all over the world. They have placed so many barracks, and they have placed so many. They have placed their armies in so many different places in the world, and yet they claim that they are not looking for war. They are the ones who are the cause of all problems. As Rodney Shakespeare was also mentioning, that the solution to all of it is that should, as the people of the world, be united against the dollar dollar controlled economy and re-establish the economy of the world on the principles that are more Islamic principles, or I would say, not only Islamic, it is, those are the principles supported by all divine religions, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, all is against what present economy is based upon, and that only increases inflation and only increases problems in the world and only allows domination of one power in the world, which is wrong. We should move towards an economy based on ancient traditional methods that existed before, and it never created these problems that we are witnessing nowadays. These problems are deliberately created to make the rich richer and the poor poorer, even at the cost of killing and getting rid of half of the population of the world. I mean, you must have heard during this pandemic that how so-called multi-billionaires of the world were planning the future of the world by getting rid of half of the population by 2023. So if this is what the intention is, how can you expect that they would be ruling the world justly and they would be leading the world in a peaceful manner? They would only think of themselves, and basically this is what is happening in Ukraine as well. Unfortunately, people of Ukraine have been involved in this conflict, and they are the ones who are suffering. And not only them, the side impact of this is all over the world. Everything has become, we are witnessing a crisis all over the world due to these problems created. Although they blame Ukraine and Russia, I would blame America for interfering in the local area by creating this problem.
Right. So, Rodney, what are your views regarding what the Syed was mentioning about the acceleration of money printing and also the move of the world away from the dollar as a currency for trade? Could you give us your views regarding that?
Yes, well, okay. Maulana touched on all the big subjects, including reduction of population, what going there up to extreme rich-poor division. The movement away from the dollar, it's very difficult, but it is happening as a result of the sanctions on Russia. They tried to destroy the Russian economy, and as a result, the ruble is now something which can and is being traded. It's actually worth more now than what it was before the invasion. It is being linked to gold and to commodities. Now, put that with the BRICS intent to get a new international currency, and it could be very rapidly something will happen, a collapse of the economy, and you realize that there's nothing really backing the American dollar except American military power, and that is no longer what it was. They may have all these guns and ships and aeroplanes, but the fact of the matter is, you've actually got a proxy war in Ukraine. By the way, there are thousands of American secret agents in Ukraine. They were claiming they didn't know anything about Ukraine. They know exactly what's going on. And those agents, and there are agents from 20 other countries, are the ones who are bringing all the arms in upon which they think they will successfully eject Russia. But anyway, the key point is that on the financial level, you look like you're going to get a crack of the global financial and economic system. Maulana was touching on, for example, extremes. I mean, did you know that Bill Gates is now the largest private owner of farmland in the United States? And the question is, why? Well, Maulana touched on something else, didn't he? He was referring to population reduction. And I'm now going to say something which, when I first came across it, it so shocked me that 2 days later, I was asked to say it, and I couldn't remember. I'll tell you what it is. It's the number of biolaboratories financed by the Pentagon in Ukraine. And I was telling people, well, I know it's above 40, 40, but my mind is just so shocked that I can't actually accurately get it. Well, the answer is apparently 46. And that is a Pentagon document. And the question is, what levers did Russia get on the USA, whereupon they said, you will tell the number of biolaboratories, you will issue this figure and say that you've been financing them? Because the only explanation is that the Russians have got another lever about this on the Americans. Now, all these things, they're all coming together. Population reduction, but the global elite, since the Club of Rome in 1972, the global elite have not had a means of the voluntary control or reduction of populations. What they do, and what they're now moving towards, is a situation in which the rich will control everybody, and everybody else will be controlled via their bank account and a tiny income. And in that way, the global elite will force a reduction in everybody's consumption except their own. And at the same time, there's no doubt they are doing viruses. And the point there is that there will be those who have access to the antidote, and there'll be those who don't. And we're all being bullied and bludgeoned into submission. And you can see what's been going on over the last 2 years. But very serious stuff. And the Ukraine war is making it worse. Now, very particularly, all this sanctioning on Russia, if you just take wheat, that they're lying their heads off. The reason why there's no exporting of wheat from Ukraine is that Ukraine put thousands of mines. Mines are sea bombs, bombs in the sea, which explode when a ship goes near them. And it is impossible for those ships to actually get now to any of the Ukrainian ports. So that is why the grain isn't coming out. They're now accusing the Russians of stealing the grain. Well, however you look at that, the fact of the matter is, if they are stealing it, they at least be stealing it in order to sell it. You can't have the argument both ways. You don't steal grain in order not to sell it. So that's at least one way it's coming onto the market. But food prices are shooting up. And if you are someone that lives if you're one of the half of the population of this world that lives on under $5.50 a day, and 20% of the population live on under $1.80 a day. The slightest move in food prices and you're starving. And that is going on. And countries like, shall we say, Egypt or Ethiopia or Sudan, country after country is being hit by this rise just in basic grain prices. Things like oil and gas, like oil and things, that goes just to cooking. So the effect of the Ukraine crisis, particularly, I should say, the effect of the sanctions, are hitting everybody throughout the world. They're hitting me in the UK, they're hitting Maulana, they're hitting you, Zainab. But the effect on the poor countries of the world, and you are going to see revolution after revolution. They started in Sri Lanka, but it's stirring all the way around. And I think the inflation may be on the verge of going completely out of control. And when that does, the middle classes get hit, and then you get really serious revolutions.
Yes. Syed Mohammad Razavi, I mean, people in the United Kingdom who are in full-time employment are also having to go to the food bank. So could you please explain how have we reached this point, and how has this been exacerbated by not only just the Russia-Ukraine war that's more recent, but also we've seen the period of COVID, and before that the Brexit. How have all of this been having a compounding effect that people in the United Kingdom who are in full-time employment, I mean, we've just seen protests of the rail workers. Rodney, I'll come to you to comment on this as well, but I'd like to bring the Syed in on this, that how people in full-time employment are needing food banks. Would you comment on this, please?
We have to look at the crisis, the present crisis, and especially the economical crisis, much before COVID-19 and the Ukraine crisis, because the world was already struggling. The so-called capitalist ideology was collapsing, and was being defeated everywhere. So they had no other choice but to create false flag operations with different excuses to justify their own ideology and beliefs. So the crises were already there and the world was already suffering. Then all these things happened. And finally, now we are witnessing the problems, and in future we will see more of these problems. And I was told by an expert that the future wars are going to be on food and water, especially water will be one of the sources of fights and disagreements in the world. At the moment is oil and food, but in future it will be more than this. So we really need to, especially the intellectuals and the nations of the world who have witnessed all these kind of atrocities throughout history, they should wake up and get united against the control that America and so-called few countries who run United Nations want to. They basically want to dominate the world. So we have to wake up and strengthen the non-aligned movement, and or the Shanghai group also needs to become more stronger and united against all of these activities that are being created. And I hope that it will, because people are already fed up. They don't trust the existing media. People depend on social media and the news that they receive from their own sources. So changes are happening, and media like this has to create more awareness between people.
Sure. Yes, Rodney, go ahead.
Yes, well, Maulana was touching on some of the big ones. He referred to social and economic changes. Now, if I could just say a word about the yellow vests in France, because that tells you what's really going on. These yellow vest people, who were they? Where did they come from? Well, they were outside Paris for a start, and they started wearing their yellow vests on the roundabouts. And they stood there and saying, the latest rise in petrol is hitting us. And when people questioned them, they suddenly realized that about 25% of the French population were in the same situation as the yellow vests. And it is the same in the UK. And it is going up to 40%. And the word is precariat. Precarious means uncertain. And then there's that old socialist word, the proletariat. And the precariat are not the people in the rail unions. That is the key point. The precariat are people who are in temporary jobs or part-time jobs or no-as contract, who have two other features. Very often they have an element of welfare benefit, and so they are bullied and controlled and humiliated by the requirements that they must turn up and they must do this and they must do that. And the other thing is that they are highly educated. Now, and there's one other characteristic. They've generally lost the confidence coming from class identity. Now, that is the precariat. And it is a modern phenomenon. And mainstream economics says, oh, there'll always be plenty of jobs, etc., well-paying. Complete lies. What is actually happening is that the actual wealth creation is going into the hands of the capital instruments owned by a narrow lot. That's why the wealth gap is increasing. And you have at the moment plenty of jobs.
Right? The millionaires and billionaires have just completely their numbers have increased quite drastically during COVID time. So the wealth gap, as you're saying, is quite evidently increasing.
They've gone up, and so have a section of the technological groupings. But this precariat, which I am describing, is at roughly 25% in France and roughly 25% in the UK. And it is probably not going to get on the property ladder. It is going very rapidly now into debt, because you see, that's that point where inflation is hitting them. They don't have much excess spending. They only goes on to the essentials, and you get 15, 20% on inflation. And in no time at all, they're maxing out their credit cards and borrowing, trapping themselves into debt. Now, mainstream economics says, oh, don't worry, but it does matter. Because what Maulana was referring to right early on, he was talking about the Great Reset, the World Economic Forum, the elitists who are grabbing the ownership, grabbing all the economics, huge wealth power. And at the same time, you're getting this, it actually happening, the precariat. And young people today, no matter how well qualified, right way around the world, people want to work. They want to be, and they say, well, I get educated. Why haven't I got a job? Well, the answer is the way the systems work, you will not get a job, and if you do, it will be just a few dollars a day. So something very profound is happening. They do not have an answer to it in mainstream economics, and it is an outrage that they dare to say things to people like, "Oh, you will be all right," and this, because what's happening, they are going for an complete and absolute control of ordinary people who will be a low income, and everything, their expenditure will be controlled, and they will be spied on. You will get, if I may just mention, a book, Brave New World, written in 1932 by Aldous Huxley. I do recommend that if you want to know what's coming down the line.
Thank you for that analysis, Rodney. Syed Mohammad, Russia is a superpower when it comes to the production of raw materials and food and energy. And we've seen, because of the sanctions, there have been ripple effects globally on the prices of these commodities, on prices of food, on prices of energy. How has that? Because our topic is specifically about the effects of this Russia-Ukraine war on the citizens of the United Kingdom. Of course, whatever we are facing globally is faced by other citizens too. But what is happening on the ground regarding food prices and energy prices, and how is that affecting the citizens in the United Kingdom? The layperson on the street, how is this war impacting them? We've seen the cost of living crisis happening in the United Kingdom. Is all of this linked?
Yes, I mean, Russia, I read this in one of the articles on the internet, that Russia was well prepared for this. And Russian leaders did predict, especially after the collapse of Russia and what happened to Gorbachev. And after that, the Russians started to look at the world differently, and they gradually removed all their savings from changed the savings from dollars into gold, and reduced the amount of foreign currency internationally, and that is why probably all these sanctions and everything that is created is not that damaging. And I'm hearing now rumors that the European leaders and America may come to some kind of agreement with Russia, and they will gradually accept the defeat. And because if it continues, Russian currency is not being affected as it was expected. Sanctions are not working because they had planned this well ahead of time, and the result is the poor people of the world suffering, and all those who took part in creating this war against Russia are also suffering. I mean, we are witnessing it in UK. I mean, the food and uh, the food that we used to get easily in supermarkets in UK is now not available. There are two reasons for it. One is Brexit, and the second is Ukraine war. Uh, and it's obvious everywhere the side effects of this. So I think at the end, Russia will come out of these crises successfully, and the world will eventually accept to live with the present circumstances that the world is facing with.
Hmm.
Can I comment there? Well,
Yes,
Maulana referred to, the word is that they're thinking of a settlement in Ukraine. Well, the first point is they had the chance to settle. They should have just left Donetsk and Luhansk as part of Ukraine, and not try to kill them, and at the same time not go into NATO. And the problem now is, of course, is that basically Ukraine, it's going to collapse. And so it's going to be on the Russian terms, which, by the way, would just be the Russian-speaking areas of Ukraine around to Odessa. It won't be the whole of Ukraine. But anyway, the key point is this, Zainab, referring to your question. Prices are shooting up, and the sanctions are just precipitating something which was already happening. And to stop it happening, they are going to do two things. They're going to have to remove all the sanctions. But Boris Johnson is saying, oh, all this inflation, all this stress is a price we must pay for helping Ukraine, a corrupt fascist state of the worst sort in the world. Secondly, you could halve the price of oil, like that, zunk, just by honouring the agreement with Iran. At this moment, they're talking about it. Reviving the JCPOA atomic agreement. Now, if that is revived, why should you trust the Americans? There's only one way that you can trust the Americans, only one way. And that would be if the Americans pay up for all the losses they have, billions of dollars they forced on Iran, and pay up for the people who died as a result of their sanctions, and pay up for General Qasem Soleimani. And in that case, you can halve the price. So if you want to solve this great price now, which is leading to political change and will eventually lead to the fall of governments, you are going to have to, as Maulana indicates, you're going to have to end the war in some way. You are going to have to get rid of the sanctions on Russia in a clear, simple way. And you are going to get rid of the sanctions on Iran, and whilst you're about it, Venezuela. But all that means is that the shift in power away from America will be increasing even faster.
Yes. Rodney, can you talk to us about the levels of debt as well that is increasing, both on the personal, corporate, and national levels?
The system works on two lots of financing all the time. When it finances, and it does not finance straight into the real economy and the spreading of the economy, but all the time when it finances at interest and also at compound interest. And at the same time, it finances the consumer at rates very often up to 25 or even 30%. And all this financing and interest goes on, and they never address the real issue of why are most people insufficiently productive, so that they have to go into debt in order to fund their reasonable expenditure. And so behind the whole system, there is an onward going impetus to increase debt. And present debt levels at this moment, personal debt levels, they are shooting up even more. Corporation debt levels and national debt levels are higher than those in 2008. Countries like Greece, their national debt level is, I think, 230% of GDP. And once it goes past 100, if you had it. Italy is, I don't know, 160, 170. The whole thing is building up to an absolutely colossal crash. Of course, what you can do is you can print more money and allow more debt. But this goes on until suddenly confidence cracks. And as you print more money, so the inflation increases. and you never catch up with inflation with your pay rise, the rail union people are not going to catch up with inflation. The barristers are not going to catch up in inflation. The nurses have been sold out. They're not going to catch up with inflation. So the thing is insoluble now. The debt levels are too high. It goes on, and suddenly they're going to raise interest rates very sharply to try and stop the inflation. And when they do that, the crash of the global economy will be sudden and violent. And you may well see fascist movements arising. What is happening now is not a shift away from American power, but we're actually moving into a very dangerous situation in which the levels of debt are one of the big factors. The debt is now unrepayable.
Yes. Yes. Well, I'm afraid we're reaching the end of the program. Before we wind up the program, Syed, would you like to comment on your opinion as to how can the world avoid going? I mean, Rodney clearly believes that the world is approaching economic and environmental disasters and crises. But in your opinion, how can we avoid and how can we shift our thinking in order to avoid going into such a crisis and a complete
I think
breakdown?
the only solution is to not to look at already tested ways of running the world economy. We should look at the world differently and find alternative ways, as Rodney Shakespeare has mentioned several times, that as long as we continue to base our economy on the present system, we will never be successful. We have to revive and review how the economy of the world is run, and we need to introduce better ways by learning from the mistakes in the past. And I hope that people, especially the leaders, come to their senses and recognize this problem and save the world rather than being selfish.
Thank you. I mean, Rodney, you have given us a solution already, which is honoring the GCPOA and to solve the fuel crisis and the energy crisis. What other shifts in thinking do we need to apply or implement in order to save ourselves going through the economic and environmental crisis?
Just understand this, that jobs for most people are no longer the way forward. That they have to come to individual capital ownership, because that's only the other thing. See, there's capital which produces wealth, and there's jobs which produces wealth. And the trouble is that the jobs are creating a smaller percentage of the wealth. And so unless you can come to wider capital ownership, and for that you need to understand new methods to achieve that. The mass of people are going to end up being lower and relatively lower and get more and more controlled. Democracy ought to mean that everybody has, and by everybody I mean everybody, has at least some form of independent income sufficient for their basic needs. Well, as the thing is going on in this moment, 2/3 of the population is not going to have that, and the little that they will be given in future will be heavily controlled via their digital bank account. This is Maulana early on referring to the elites and the World Economic Forum. They have said what Maulana said, and they're going to go for it. It's the Great Reset. They're going for a technological control, a digital currency in which there'll be a tiny, massively wealthy elite. They refer to the fourth industrial revolution, in which the mass of people will be useless and worthless. Those are the words they use. They will be useless and worthless because they will not actually be physically productive. They think that they're productive. And the trouble is, as soon as you use that word useless, you're back to Maulana early on. That will be, in God's eyes, everybody is of worth. In the eyes of the global elite, 40, 50, 60% of the people will have no value at all. And you can see that virus coming down the track, can't you? And you can see the games they're up to, because you see 40 to 60% of the population have no value. This is fascist ideology. It's the same game they get up to in Nazism. Oh, by the way, in Ukraine, the Ukrainians have a similar fascist attitude towards the Russian-speaking Ukrainians. But we won't go into that.
And you're already predicting that there will be a lot of protests and toppling of governments in order to prevent this by the masses. Very worrying times ahead and very uncertain times ahead, I suppose. But thank you very much for your analysis, Rodney. And thank you, Syed, for joining us today. Of course, thank you to the dear viewers for listening. I'd like to remind you that views expressed on today's program are of the guests and the presenter, and they do not reflect views of the channel. Thank you so